Thank you, and you may be seated. If you notice a big smile on my pastor's face, it's not only because his college football team won, his all-time favorite baseball team won last night. So his Braves are going to the World Series. All right?
In spite of my negativity about them disappointing me over 30 years, but I only do that to protect my feelings. When you're negative and pessimistic, and it doesn't turn out the way you want, it doesn't hurt so bad. So for all of you positive Braves fans that pulled them through, good on you, because I contributed zero. I just watched and cheered and kept waiting for the inevitable wreck to happen that did not happen this year. Though we tried to make it happen by putting Luke Jackson in the game again last night, and none of that was prepared as part of my sermon. You can blame Glenn for getting me going down that road. Enough of the Braves. Let's talk about something far better than the Braves, okay? Turn with me in your Bibles to Revelation chapter 18, where we're going to continue to read and talk about the end of anti-Christian culture, the judgment and the fall of Babylon, the great prostitute that tempts and seduces people away from God with promises of fame and fortune and success and power and acceptance and happiness. Babylon being, or anti-Christian culture being, Satan's third general through which he wars against Christ and his church. We covered the first 6 verses of this chapter last Sunday morning, so let's begin by reading them once again. Beginning in verse 1, it says, "After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living.' Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup that she mixed.'" In these verses, an angelic representative from God announces the fall of Babylon, or the end of anti-Christian culture, as I'm calling it. And in these verses and the rest of this chapter, he then describes God's final judgment against it. And God will judge it because of its intoxicating and evil influence on the world. You note there, and we've noted before, especially in chapter 17, the influence that anti-Christian culture has on the nations, on all the peoples of the world, on even the kings of the world, and mentioned for the first time here in chapter 18, the merchants of the earth. Meaning that a big part of anti-Christian culture, and therefore a big participant in this judgment that God will pour out, is the economy of the world, for the most part. The financial matters of the world, the way finances and money is conducted in the world will be a part of this judgment. For you see, Babylon has made a god of money. And Babylon has made a god of the things that money can buy. A god of materialism. This is the god of anti-Christian culture. Therefore, as with all other false gods and everything else that is false, it will be judged. God will remember its sins and pay it back. And because of this, He calls we His people out of it. Again, verse 4, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. There, God commands us, as we talked about last Sunday morning, just as He commanded Israel in the Old Testament, to go out of, to depart from, to flee from Babylon and its judgment. That is, to stay away from, or to run away from, as the case may be, or to come out of, as the case may be, from the great prostitute. Meaning God commands us here to reject anti-Christian culture, to reject its values, to reject its purposes and pursuits and promises, to reject its worldview, to reject its sins and its crimes. It's crimes not only against God, but in this context, it's crimes against other people, the people of the world. What we read in verse 4 was a call from God, a command from God to His people for us to be holy, to be set apart from anti-Christian culture, to be different from anti-Christian culture. And He issues this call here because you see, if those who call themselves Christians, which are many, especially in our area of the world, if those who call themselves Christians and those groups of people which call themselves churches are not holy, if we are not different, if we are not set apart from anti-Christian culture, we will be included in its judgment. We will be a part then of the end of anti-Christian culture. And you see, the end of anti-Christian culture, the judgment of Babylon, will be awful. We pick up today with verse 7. Look there again. And the first part of it says, as she, Babylon, this great prostitute, metaphorical prostitute, anti-Christian culture is what I'm calling it, as she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. I actually ended last Sunday morning with this first part of verse 7, and I told you when I read it that what it indicates is that in the end, when this final judgment is taking place, the tables will be turned for many people. Roles will be reversed for many people. That is, what they were in this life and in this age will be very different from what they will be or what they will become on that day and in the age to come. It's what Jesus meant when He said on more than one occasion, the first will be last. And He also said that the last will be first. And what He was talking about, at least in part, is that the way things are for people in this life, in this age, is not necessarily an indication of the way it's going to be for them in the life to come. There are many who have been nobodies in this life, but in the life to come, everybody will see that there's somebody to God most importantly. There are many who have had nothing in this power in terms of money or material things or fame or influence or power, who will have all of those things in the life to come and for all eternity. And more pertinent to what we're reading at the beginning of verse 7 is there are many who have had all of those things during this life who will have all of those things removed at the final judgment. So that's what Jesus meant when he said the first will be last. Look at the second part of verse 7. And we see here why this judgment will take place, specifically this reversal of roles, the tables being turned. He says, since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. How would you characterize the attitude of Babylon, anti-Christian culture, from what she says about herself there at the end of verse 7? I'd characterize it in one word: pride. You hear the pride oozing out of these words? I'm a queen. I have power. I'm on the throne. I'm no widow. I haven't lost anything. I have everything, including companionship and people. Mourning I shall never see. I only know joy, because life is good. And I'm happy with the way that life is. This is pride like ancient Babylon had. Isaiah 47 records words just like this, that ancient Babylon, literal Babylon, long before this metaphorical Babylon, said the same thing about itself. This is pride like Nebuchadnezzar had, the king of Babylon. Do you remember his great pride? Basically, I'm the king of the world, and nothing will ever stop me. This is pride like ancient Tyre, a great kingdom like Babylon had. It's pride like the captain of the Titanic had. You remember what he infamously said? Not even God could sink this ship. It's pride, unfortunately, like we've seen already from one of the churches that this letter of Revelation, this book of Revelation, was addressed to. When Jesus was speaking to the seven churches, he said back in chapter 3, verse 17, to the Laodicean church, for you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing. Same kind of pride that Babylon, the great prostitute, anti-Christian culture, has. And it's pride like many that call themselves Christians and many that call themselves churches have, particularly in Western culture and in America. Pride just like the Laodicean church. I mean, does this not apply to many? I'm rich. I've prospered. I don't need anything. And it's the way things like that work, even among those who call themselves the people of God. When we have all that we want, and in many cases all that we not just need, but all that we want, it's very easy even, though we would never put it in words, to forget just how much we need the Lord. Just how much we need salvation today. Just how much we need forgiveness of sins, eternal life through Christ alone. And so I ask you, what follows pride? What always results from pride according to the Bible? I saw some of you in a very Baptist-like way, lip it out to me. Nobody said it out loud, I don't think. I mean, we don't want to be accused of being charismatic and getting out of control. The fall. Right, according to Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before the fall or destruction. Or in the word I've used the past couple of weeks, the end, the kind of end we're talking about here in chapter 18 follows pride. Judgment follows pride. And we see that back in chapter 18, verse 8. It says, for this reason, for her pride, her plagues will come in a single day. And a single day there, like with other measurements of time and measurements period in Revelation, I don't think we should take it literally. Single day simply indicates here, not a 24-hour period, but it will come quickly. For this reason, her plagues will come in a single day, the day of the Lord, if you will. When Christ comes again, it will come in a single day. And here are the plagues. And note with me how they match up with what her pride was about. Her plagues, death, mourning, and famine. So how had she expressed, or how does anti-Christian culture express its pride? I'm no widow, so what's the judgment going to be? Death. Mourning I shall never see. And so what's part of the judgment? Mourning. I sit as a queen. I'm royalty. I'm powerful and have fame and fortune. So what's part of the judgment going to be? Famine. And she, or it says, will be burned up with fire. Again, why? Because of her pride. Because of its pride. 2 Samuel 22:28 says of God, your eyes are on the haughty to bring them down. God pays particular attention to those that are full of pride. And like a hawk, He hawks them down to bring them down because of and in their pride. If you'd like, you can turn with me back in your Bibles to Isaiah chapter 2, where God speaks to this issue through the prophet. Isaiah chapter 2, beginning in verse 11, says, the haughty looks of man shall be brought low, and the lofty pride of men shall be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. For the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low. And then it mentions in the next verses all of the things that would have been symbols of power and permanence in the ancient world that will be brought low. Against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, against all the uplifted hills, against every high tower, against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the beautiful craft. And the haughtiness of man shall be humbled, and the lofty pride of men shall be brought low, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. And the idols, the very things that we're talking and thinking about in using a phrase like anti-Christian culture, the things that we substitute for God to get our significance from, to get our happiness from, to get pleasure from, to find confidence in, things that we place our hope in rather than God. And the idols, every one of them shall utterly pass away. All of them. including anti-Christian culture. Just like Babylon passed away. I'm talking about ancient Babylon. Just like Nebuchadnezzar the Great, who turned Babylon the Great, passed away. Just like Tyre passed away. Just like the Titanic sank. Just like Rome, great and mighty Rome fell. All because of pride. When pride like this doesn't make sense, it's senseless to have this prideful attitude. I say that because of what we read at the end of verse 8. For mighty is the Lord God who has judged her. The reason I say that pride is senseless is because it fails to acknowledge that even in our earthly might, however mighty it may be, there is one who is far mightier. No matter how much power we attain in life, there is always one who is much more powerful. No matter how much we attain in life in terms of money and possessions, there is one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and that simply means not 999 or 1,001 hills, but all the hills. And so that thought should keep even the most mighty of this world humble. The thought being that there is one who is mightier. He will demonstrate his might on that day of final judgment, in judging it and bringing it to an end. You see, pride like this is blind. It's deceived. It is an evil pride. It's the kind that James wrote of in James chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or do that. As it is, you boast or you have pride in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. This is what Jesus went on to say to that church at Laodicea. Again, Revelation 3:17. They said, I'm rich, I'm prospered, I need nothing. And Jesus said, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. You can be one who has it all in the eyes of the world and yet have zero in the eyes of God. I mean, they're absolutely zero in the eyes of God. You can be 100 emoji, flex emoji, exclamation point. You can be that in the world and be a big zero to the Lord. None of it impressing Him in the least. Or in the words of Jesus, you can be rich and prosperous and have everything that you need and everything that you want and still be wretched and pitiable and poor and blind and naked. We're taught here that the culture, the world that promises so much can't provide the things that we really need. It can't. That's why when it comes to the world, though there are things in it that are good, we should treat all of its promises like fool's gold. That's what it is. It's fool's gold. I've done some reading on the gold rush in the West. in the north in Canada. And all we remember are the stories of those that struck it rich. But how many do you suppose there are who lost everything, in many cases including their lives, for everyone who struck it rich? What would you say? 100 of those for everyone that struck it rich? I think that's lowballing it. 1,000, 10,000 maybe, for everyone that struck it rich. In many cases, literally for fool's gold, what turned out to be not gold at all, fool's gold. Culture can't provide our needs, only Christ can. That's why he said to the Laodicean church in verse 18, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you may be rich, really rich. And white garments, so that you may clothe yourself, and the shame of your nakedness may not be seen, and salve to anoint your eyes, so that you may see. And where would they get this? From Christ. Only Christ, only through faith in Him. And the only way that we can have Christ is through humility, not pride. Proverbs 29:23 says, one's pride will bring him low, but he who is lowly in spirit will obtain honor. 1 Peter 5:6 says, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that in due time He may lift you up. It's really a question of who would you rather lift you up and exalt you, the world or God? And every day we choose anti-Christian culture, what we're saying is, I would rather be exalted in the eyes of the world than exalted in the eyes of God. And to that I would say, to myself and you, some of the most helpful words that we could ever remember, penned by our friends from the University of Mobile, Big Daddy Weave. Folks, we play and we sing and we live for an audience of one. Of just one. And if you make Him happy, it doesn't matter if you make every other person of the 7 billion people in the world unhappy. If you make Him happy, you're good. You're good. Proverbs 3:34 is quoted multiple times in the New Testament, including James 4:6, and it famously said, God resists the proud, but He gives grace to whom? The humble. This was the whole point of Jesus in the Beatitudes. The first 4 Beatitudes deal with this. Blessed are the poor in spirit, which is another word for humble. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn over their sinfulness, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Now, I've said that what we're seeing here in Revelation 18 is the end of anti-Christian culture. And when I say that, the end of anti-Christian culture, I want you to think about a funeral. I know that you've probably never heard that before. You know, you typically aren't taught in speaking classes to motivate people by telling them to think about a funeral. That's really what we're reading about. It's an obituary of sorts that we're reading here in Revelation 18. So I want you to think about a funeral. And what happens at funerals? Mourning. And that's what we see next in the chapter. The lovers of Babylon, this great prostitute, this great metaphorical prostitute, those mentioned in verse 3, mourning its death, mourning its end, beginning with the kings of the earth. In verses 9 and 10, look there. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality with her, who chose her over the Lord and lived in luxury with her, they will weep and wail over her, over Babylon, over anti-Christian culture when they see the smoke of her burning, the smoke of her judgment, the smoke that announces with every puff and every cloud its end. Verse 10 says they will stand far off and they will weep for her, but they won't weep with her, because at this time they won't want anything to do with her. They're far off. They want to be distanced from anti-Christian culture at this time. Why? It says in verse 10, in fear of her torment. They see the judgment that she is receiving at this time, and they don't want the same end for themselves. And they say, alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon. Note this, even in the judgment, even in the fall, the end of anti-Christian culture, they are not ceasing to acknowledge its greatness. It's burning as they speak, and they're speaking about how great it is, how mighty it is. Even in its judgment, they're still not acknowledging the might and the power and the greatness of God. That'd be like watching a George Foreman, Muhammad Ali fight, one of several that you could choose from, and your take from those fights is, that George Foreman was great. Now he was. But you wouldn't get that from watching him fight Ali. 4 people know what I'm talking about. YouTube it. YouTube it. If you don't know, George Foreman was great. Some of you don't even know. Long before he sold grills, he was a boxer, a bad boxer. He did not look kind and friendly. He may be the most intimidating boxer I've ever seen to look at. He was huge. He had pork chop sideburns. He was a dude. And he had showed his dudeness over all the people that he had boxed against before he fought Ali. And Ali played with him multiple times and wore him out and beat him down. Now, let me say that again. If you watch those fights between those two, and your conclusion after watching the fights is George Foreman is mighty, now, what should your conclusion be if you watch those? Ali was mighty. You see the illustration I made? God has demonstrated His superior might at this time over Babylon, and the kings of the earth are still praising the might of Babylon. And then they say, for in a single hour, and listen, that's why I said earlier, single day is probably not to be taken literally. Single here, hour, day, indicates a short amount of time, this final time, the day of the Lord. For in a single hour, your judgment has come. I read verses 9 and 10, and the first thought that occurs to me is, how the mighty have fallen. You want another boxing illustration for that? Watch Tyson and Buster Douglas. How the mighty have fallen. For those of you that have no clue, Mike Tyson was unbeatable. Buster Douglas was a nobody until he beat Mike Tyson in Tokyo. How the mighty have fallen, or how the mighty will fall. How anti-Christian culture and all of its power and influence will fall, and with it the hopes and the happiness of so many. First, the kings of the world, the real power people of the world, and then the merchants of the world. Look at verses 11 through 13, which say, and the merchants of the earth weep and they mourn for her. You see, again, it's a funeral. Are you thinking about a funeral? First, you got the king section, and they are weeping and mourning over the fall of Babylon. And then you've got the merchant section at the funeral, the economic section, the traders of the world, the industry, the commerce of the world, and they're mourning too. They're not mourning because of Babylon. They're not mourning because of the loss of Babylon. They're mourning because of what the loss of Babylon means that they will lose. It says they're mourning since no one buys their cargo anymore. See, anti-Christian culture is what peddles or markets, sells all the things that they convince people will make them happy and successful and powerful and people of influence. And they have that no more to peddle their goods. So they weep because of what they've lost. And then in verses 12 and 13, what we have is a list of the goods. Now, we read that, and I don't know that we get what's going on here because most of these things, don't mean a lot to us. Some of them do, but some don't. These things that we find in 12 and 13 were in the ancient world the things that were the things to have. You know what I'm talking about? The things that you get if you're somebody. The things that you have if you have enough to have. The things that are status symbols that let people know. I'll use a phrase from my childhood. When I was a child, if you wore no-name shoes, the other kids would say, he's got buddies on. Anybody ever heard that before? Buddies. You never wanted anybody to say you were wearing buddies. Okay, buddy. Nike, good. This before Reebok. Ponies, okay. Never buddies. Never buddies. So this is the name brand stuff. Status symbol stuff. This is the stuff that if they'd have had social media in their day, the influencer of the world would have been wearing these. They'd have been taking pictures of themselves with these things. So what are they? Cargoes of gold, still important. Silver, jewels, pearls. Fine linen and purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth. All kinds of scented wood used to make, by the way, furniture, build homes. All kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses and chariots, whereas today we wouldn't say horses and chariots, but we might say a Benz or a Beamer. If you have a Benz or a Beamer, didn't mean to single you out. Good for you. But it doesn't mean you're better than somebody that wears buddies. Right? Right? We might care about the kind of cars that people have, but God doesn't. God has no more regard for the person that drives up in a Lamborghini than he does the person that drives up in a Le Mans. Some of you don't know what that is. Cheryl could tell you. She had a Le Mans. My point being, it's not a Lamborghini. I think the front end fell out of it while she was driving one day. Notice the last thing that's on the list. And slaves. That is human souls. Notice the way that's worded. That is human souls. In large part, the economy of Rome, like so many economies down through the years, was built on the back of cheap, or in this case, free labor. And while others might be impressed by wealth that's amassed by oppressing other people, God is not impressed. Never has been, never will be. It's one of the things that will be judged on that final day. We read this about slavery and my mention of it being a staple, a foundation of the Roman economy. One helpful thing for us in our day is it is a lesson for many who in our country might have been led to believe by media or otherwise, culture, that Americans invented slavery and are the only people who have ever done it. And that's simply not true. Slavery's been around as long as the world existed, and unknown to many people, there are still numerous countries in the world in which slavery still goes on. Just as bad as anything that ever existed 300 or 400 years ago or 2,000 years ago. So that's helpful. In saying that, though, I don't want to do what so many of us do in America today and use a statement like that to minimize how awful American chattel slavery was. If you find yourself arguing for how slavery really wasn't so bad in America, I think you probably need to check yourself seriously. It's likely an indication that something else is going on in your heart. Because I could get you to talk with people and read things that would surely convince you that it wasn't good. And that any examples of goodness in it would be exceptions rather than the rule. So let's own up to our own country's implicity in that. And at the same time, others who always want to drag that up need to own up as well that it's not today, that though it's not perfect, things have certainly improved, and that we're not the only people, by we I mean Americans, that have ever done it. Now here's the biggest thing. That said, here's what I really want us to take from it. Not that. If you remember that, that's good, but I really want you to remember this. What should stand out to us here is that this is a list of commodities. And included in the list is what? People. And that's why, after saying the word slaves, the author adds human souls. The point being that people are not commodities. Never is it acceptable to view another person as a commodity, something to merely be used. Every single person who has ever lived, every single person who is alive today, regardless of color or bank account or social media followers, every single person is an individual who has been made in the image of God, and who is therefore worthy of respect like we owe unto God, has dignity in and of themselves, regardless of what they do or achieve, has dignity because they have the mark of God on their lives. N.T. Wright says about this that when you worship idols, the idols demand sacrifices. When you worship money, it will demand sacrifices. And some of those sacrifices will be human. What a condemning word. He is right on. When we worship money, people become commodities. They become things to be used to make more money or to keep whatever we've got, rather than people, human souls, whose treatment, that is, by how we've treated them, dealt with them, even in financial matters, we will be judged. Dennis Johnson said about this that this is the culmination of a decadent culture's ruthless pursuit of pleasure, whatever the cost to others. And it's the issue. You know, when people get treated like commodities, whether it be because of their color or their nationality or how much money they have, do you know when people get treated like money rather than people? It's when we're more concerned with pleasure than we are with people. It's when our happiness is more important than our holiness. It's when our getting what we want is more important than what other people need and what God expects. And so you see, this explains not only the ill of slavery, the great sin of slavery, this also explains all sorts of other social ills. Think about it with me. Why is prostitution the proverbial oldest vocation in the world? Why does it flourish? Even in some contexts that are just worse than we want to imagine. Why? Because there's a market for it. Why is there a market for it? Because people's pleasure is more important to them than people, than the pain of other people. It's not just prostitution, pornography. You ever read stats on pornography? Have you ever read stats on how many pornographic sites are visited every day in comparison to the big ones like YouTube, Google, Facebook? You could add all of Facebook and Google and YouTube, you could add all of it and multiply it tenfold, and it wouldn't equal up to the number of times people are visiting pornographic sites every day. And the backbone of the pornographic industry, you know, is sex trafficking. Let's be honest about it. That's what it is. We hear a lot about treating people, women in particular, well. And listen, we should. Men, women are not commodities to be used. They're made in the image of God. And that whole industry is built on the use of women. You say, well, they volunteer for it. But they volunteer for it. In some cases, they don't. Even when they do volunteer for it, it's because there's a market for it. And the market exists because, in particular, men, many men, care more about their pleasure than they do about their pain. That's somebody's daughter. Did you hear me? That's somebody's daughter. You can't convince me that she wouldn't be doing that if she didn't have to or feel like she didn't have to or weren't trapped in it. Don't bring me your exceptions. Exceptions don't disprove a rule. It all exists because of this. I could go on. Gambling. Why? Because people care more about their pleasure than others' pain. Alcohol, drugs, adultery. Why does one spouse cheat on another spouse? Because they care more about their pleasure than the people in their life that should mean the most to them. Promiscuity, abortion, homosexuality, gay marriage. I could go on and on and on. Why do these things flourish? Because of this. I want what makes me happy, and I don't care what it costs anybody else. And it's evil. It's evil. And a big part of defeating it, whatever it might be, is realizing that it's evil and that it causes others pain. And here's the thing. We go to these things because we think they bring us pleasure. But I ask you, how long does the pleasure last? Not very long. And what ends up happening is they bring pain to you too. And pain to me too. Verse 14 says, the fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you. And all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. That is, all these idols that characterize anti-Christian culture on this day will be gone, and the purpose for which all of the people who have bought into it have lived, it's gone, it's no more. James Hamilton said, we need to see that those who trade God in for the world's misuse of God's gifts will have all of God's gifts taken away from them. And that's what's going on in this scenario. All of the things that are mentioned here and that I've mentioned, all of them aren't bad things. Many of them, in fact, are good things that will even be included when we get to the description of heaven. Heaven will have gold, precious jewels, all of these things. So it isn't intrinsically something wrong with them. What's wrong is when we take even the precious gifts of God and turn them into God. That's what's wrong. When we worship the gift rather than the giver, that's what's wrong. When we find our pleasure in the gifts rather than the God who gives the gifts, that's what's wrong. When we live for the things rather than the God who has graciously provided the things, that's what's wrong. And if that's the case, those who have misused God's gifts will have all of God's gifts taken away from them. It's what Jesus meant when he said, whoever would save or gain or keep his life will end up losing it in the end. Look at verse 15. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off, just like the kings, in fear of her torment, just like the kings, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, same thing that the king said. Not the greatness of God, but the greatness of Babylon. For the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. That's why Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 7:31, this world in its present form is passing away. It's what James wrote about in chapter 5 of his epistle, beginning in verse 1. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded. Their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your field. Who that's talking about? People they treated like commodities rather than people. People they oppressed. They may not have been slaves, but they oppressed them. While they had more than any human could ever spend, their workers don't have enough to live on. That's what it's talking about. Or just barely enough to live on. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person who does not or cannot resist you. Jesus, because of this, said in Matthew 6:19 and 20, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust corrupt, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust corrupt, and thieves don't break in and steal. Did you know that the economy of heaven is inflation proof? There will be no $3 a 50 gallon of gas in heaven. I'm convinced of that. It's recession proof, the economy of heaven. There's no Black Mondays or Black Fridays in heaven. You want your money and your stuff to be saved? Send it on ahead. Invest it in the kingdom now. And it'll pay off big time in the end. And look at verses 17 through 19 as we wrap it up this morning. Second part of verse 17 says, "And all the shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea, they stood far off." Again, we're thinking of a funeral. "And they cried as they saw the smoke of her burning, what city was like the great city?" Still don't get it. "They threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste." You see, the death, the funeral of Babylon, the end of anti-Christian culture will be the occasion of mourning for the people of the world, for the people of Antichrist, but not for the people of Christ. Look at verse 20. "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her." We see yet another contrast in Revelation. The contrast here is between the weeping and the mourning of the world and the rejoicing of the people of Christ because of God's judgment against anti-Christian culture. As I prayed this morning, and as I've said in weeks gone by, it's not just that we're saved from God's wrath, we will be saved through God's wrath, through His judgment of the world. It's the answer to the prayers of the people of God that we saw in the fifth seal in chapter 6. The judgment of the world, of anti-Christian culture, will be our salvation from it, from Satan's third general, which wars against us, which persecutes us, as we'll be reminded in just a moment. Verse 21 says, "Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone, threw it into the sea, saying, So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence, and will be found no more." That's the same imagery that God used of Babylon in the Old Testament, that they'd be like a great stone or mountain thrown into the sea, never to be heard from again. It reminds me of the words of Jesus in Matthew 18. You remember where He said, "If any of you causes one of these little ones to sin, it would be better off for you to have a great millstone hung around your neck and to be thrown out into the sea." And what's the imagery there? Destruction, devastation, be heard from never again. Verse 22 says, "And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and of trumpets will be heard in you no more. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you anymore, none of them. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more." No more is repeated over and over again. "And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of the bridegroom and the bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all the nations were deceived by your sorcery." What's being described there is complete judgment, final judgment, where even the good things that characterize this world, things that bring joy like family and weddings and work and food, are gone, lost to those that aren't the people of God. This is the end of anti-Christian culture. And And we're reminded of why in the last part of the chapter, which says, "For all the nations were deceived by your sorcery." That's why God will judge it, because of their deception of the world, or its deception. Verse 24, "And in her was found the blood of the prophets and the saints, and of all who have been slain on the earth." That's why judgment will come against Babylon. Because of its deception, and because of its persecution of the people of God. The end of anti-Christian culture will then be the just judgment of those who unjustly judge the people of God. It will be the defeat and the destruction and the death of that which defeated and destroyed and killed God's people down through the years. This will be the death of agents of death and deception. William Hendrickson said the main point for us to observe is that the pleasure-mad, arrogant world, with all of its seductive luxuries and pleasures, with its anti-Christian philosophy and culture, with its teeming multitudes that have forsaken God and have lived according to the lust of the flesh and the desires of the mind, all of it, every one of them, shall perish. Anti-Christian culture will come to an end. And so I ask you, as I did in closing last week, how does that make you feel? Like crying? Or cheering? Your answer, your honest answer, reveals your true love, whether it's Christ or Antichrist, whether it's culture or church. Remember that only Christ can satisfy you truly and eternally. And remember that His love and His happiness, true love and true happiness, eternal love, eternal happiness, can only be found in His bride, not a prostitute. So choose Christ and His church, not the culture. Turn from your sin. Turn from Babylon. Turn from anti-Christian culture to Christ and trust on Him for salvation, and keep on turning and trusting. And we'll be rejoicing forever in the end. Stand with me. Bow your heads and close your eyes.